Welcome to Starbound. My name is General G, and I'll be your narrator today. Nearly 500 supporters get early access to our stories, including brand new episodes of Sunspire Academy and Freyr and Remeke. If you'd like to unlock early access and support new episodes in future series, tap Join below to become a Starbound member. Now, let's get into today's story. The problem with recreating the genetics of legendary warriors, senior bioengineer Keth Morvac reflected, was that legends rarely included detailed specifications for height, weight, or the disappointing tendency to ask polite questions instead of crushing enemies. "Run the analysis again," she instructed her assistant, staring at the holographic display floating above designation 887 Beta's containment pod. The creature, she supposed she had to call him that, though he looked disappointingly ordinary, slept peacefully behind the transparent aluminum, his chest rising and falling with mundane regularity. "Same results, Senior Engineer. Physical capabilities baseline, combat reflexes adequate, psychological profile extremely systematic, highly cooperative, no apparent aggressive tendencies." The assistant's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news to a superior who just spent 3 decades on this project. Keth Morvac's secondary arms twitched in frustration. The progenitor DNA fragment they discovered on that ancient probe had promised so much. The fragments were degraded, certainly, but the base genetic structure had seemed so heroic, noble. The kind of beings who might have carved an empire from the void itself. Instead, they'd grown something that said please and thank you, and had somehow managed to optimize the efficiency of the laboratory's cleaning protocols without being asked. "Senior Engineer?" Commander Nix Valdris stood in the laboratory's entrance, her uniform bearing the pristine creases that marked her as someone who had never seen actual combat. "The Council requests a status report on the Progenitor Restoration Project." "The Council may request whatever it pleases," Keth Morvac muttered. "The fact remains that we have spent enormous resources recreating what appears to be a particularly polite maintenance technician." 887 Beta stirred in his pod, as if sensing their conversation. His eyes opened, unremarkable brown, not the golden fire of legend, and he sat up with careful, methodical movements. "Good morning, Senior Engineer Keth Morvac, Commander Nix Valdris. I trust you both achieved optimal rest cycles?" His voice was pleasant, respectful, and entirely lacking in the menacing undertones one might expect from a weapon of war. "You see?" Keth Morvac gestured at the pod. "He greets his creators like a subordinate reporting for duty. Where is the savage cunning, the tactical brilliance, the primal fury that must have driven the progenitors to greatness?" Commander Nix Valdris studied 887 Beta. The creature waited patiently for their response, hands folded in his lap like a student awaiting instruction. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "we have been approaching this incorrectly. If the genetics are stable and the specimen is cooperative—" "You wish to deploy him?" Keth Morvac's voice pitched higher in disbelief. "For observational purposes only. We have detected a planet in the Sol system that appears to contain biological matches to his genetic template. Primitive creatures, but numerous. If we can understand how the progenitor genetics express themselves in a natural environment—" 887 Beta raised his hand slightly, as if requesting permission to speak. "Yes," Nix Valdris said. "I would be honored to serve in whatever capacity you deem appropriate. Might I suggest that extended observation protocols would benefit from detailed documentation standards? I have prepared several preliminary forms that could streamline the data collection process." The two Ordani exchanged glances. Morvac's expression suggested she was contemplating the relative merits of spacing herself versus spacing 887 Beta. "Very well," Nix Valdris decided. "Prepare him for deployment. Perhaps studying his primitive relatives will provide insight into where our restoration process went astray." The transport pod that delivered Eddie, name as given by the aliens, to Earth, was programmed to self-destruct after his disembarkation, which struck him as unnecessarily wasteful. He had submitted a 12-point efficiency report suggesting alternative disposal methods, but Command had not responded. Perhaps they were still reviewing his recommendations. He stood at the edge of what his briefing materials identified as Millbrook, Georgia, United States of America, Sol 3, and methodically surveyed his operational environment. The settlement appeared to be organized around a central commercial district, with residential structures radiating outward in a pattern that suggested organic growth rather than planned development. Fascinating. Eddie withdrew a handheld recording device and began his initial observations. Day 1, hour 0730 local. Settlement displays suboptimal urban planning, though traffic flow patterns indicate successful adaptation to geographical constraints. Commercial structures show evidence of regular maintenance. Atmospheric composition within acceptable parameters for extended observation. A ground vehicle passed by, slowing as the occupant observed Eddie speaking into his device. Eddie waved politely. The vehicle's occupant waved back before continuing down the street. Interesting social protocol. He made a note. Indigenous population demonstrates non-threatening acknowledgement behaviors toward unfamiliar individuals. The central commercial district consisted of approximately 24 structures, including what appeared to be a food service establishment with Williams Family Diner painted across the front window. Eddie's mission parameters included requirements for nutritional intake, and his research indicated that diners were optimal locations for observing indigenous social patterns. He was walking toward the establishment when he heard raised voices from the adjacent alley. "Just keep walking, boy. Nobody wants to see your kind around here." Eddie paused. His briefing materials had included extensive preliminary documentation of local social dynamics. The raised voice had the aggressive tonality patterns that suggested potential violence. The individuals had cornered a fourth against the alley wall. The lone individual appeared to be a young male, approximately 23 years old, carrying what appeared to be art supplies. The three aggressors were larger and positioned to prevent escape. Eddie's training included 47 different intervention protocols for hostage situations, crowd control, and asymmetrical combat scenarios. However, his observations suggested this situation called for something different. He approached the group with measured steps, his hands visible and empty. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I'm new to the area and could not help but notice this interaction. Might I ask what specific objectives you're attempting to achieve?" The three aggressors turned toward him. The largest one, a man in his 30s with arms like tree trunks, looked Eddie up and down with obvious dismissal. "Walk away. This ain't your business." "I appreciate that perspective," Eddie replied. "However, I'm conducting observational research on local social dynamics, and this situation presents several interesting questions. For instance, what metrics are you using to determine the desirability of this individual's presence?" The second aggressor, thinner but with the wiry build of someone accustomed to violence, stepped closer. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Well, you indicated that nobody wants to see his kind around here. I'm curious about the methodology you use to survey local opinion. Did you conduct interviews? Distribute questionnaires? What was your sample size?" The third man, who had been silent until now, squinted at Eddie. "Are you making fun of us?" "Not at all. I'm genuinely interested in understanding your reasoning process. You've made a definitive statement about community preferences, which suggests comprehensive data collection. Could you share your findings?" "Look, college boy," the large man said, "just walk away before you get hurt." "That's an interesting threat assessment," Eddie said, withdrawing his notepad. "Could you elaborate on the specific harm you're contemplating? Are we discussing minor bruising, major lacerations, or systemic trauma requiring hospitalization?" The young man against the wall, Mark, his ID card read from this distance, watched the exchange with growing bewilderment. "What are you writing?" the thin aggressor demanded. "Observational notes. Your threat contained insufficient detail for proper risk analysis. Could you be more specific about your intended violence? It would help me complete my documentation." "Jesus Christ!" the large man muttered. "You're crazy." "I prefer methodical," Eddie corrected. "Now, returning to my earlier question about your survey methodology." "Forget this," the third man said. "Let's go." The three aggressors left the alley with the purposeful stride of people who had just realized they were in a conversation with someone who might keep asking questions indefinitely. Mark Delacroix straightened his jacket and stared at Eddie with an expression somewhere between gratitude and confusion. "What the hell just happened?" he asked. "Conflict de-escalation through systematic inquiry, it seems," Eddie replied, making a final note. The aggressors appeared to be operating on emotional rather than rational motivation. When pressed for a logical justification of their actions, they abandoned their objective rather than expose the weakness of their position. "That was," Mark shook his head, "that was either the stupidest thing I've ever seen or the smartest." "Optimally both," Eddie said. He extended his hand. "I am designated... My name is Eddie." "Mark." They shook hands. "Look, I don't know where you came from, but those guys have been hassling me for weeks. Thank you." "What specific harassment behaviors were they exhibiting?" Mark studied Eddie's face, apparently trying to determine if this was another joke. "You really talk like that all the time? Is my communication style causing difficulty? I can adjust my linguistic patterns if necessary." "No, it's just..." Mark laughed, a sound with more relief than humor. "It's different, but good different, I think. Come on, let me buy you a coffee. It's the least I can do." Eddie consulted his mission parameters. Integration with indigenous population was a primary objective. "That would be acceptable. I would appreciate the opportunity to observe local social customs." "You're going to fit right in around here," Mark said with a grin. "Millbrook loves people who are just a little bit strange." Williams' Family Diner occupied a corner location with large windows that provided excellent sightlines for observational purposes. Eddie cataloged the layout: 12 tables, 8 counter stools, kitchen visible through a pass-through window, while Mark led him to a booth in the back. The establishment's proprietor appeared to be a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and the efficient movements of someone who had been managing food service for decades. "Morning, Mark," she said, filling 2 cups without being asked. "Who's your friend?" "This is Eddie. Eddie, meet Betty Williams. She and her husband Roy run the best, well, the only diner in Millbrook." "Mrs. Williams," Eddie said, rising from his seat, "I am pleased to make your acquaintance. Might I compliment you on the optimal placement of your customers' seating relative to natural light sources? The positioning maximizes visibility while minimizing glare. Very efficient." Betty paused in her coffee pouring and looked at Eddie as if he'd just spoken in a foreign language. Well, thank you, I think." "Eddie's new in town," Mark explained. "He has, an interesting way of looking at things." "I can see that." Betty's smile became slightly more full. "Where are you from, honey?" Eddie had prepared for this question. "I've been traveling extensively. I'm interested in studying local communities and their operational systems." "You some kind of efficiency expert?" "In a manner of speaking. I find that most problems can be solved through systematic analysis and appropriate allocation of resources." Betty refilled their cups again, though neither had taken more than a sip. "Well, if you're looking for problems to solve, you might want to talk to Roy about our walk-in cooler. Been acting up for weeks." "I would be happy to examine your refrigeration system," Eddie said immediately. Thermal regulation failures typically result from one of 7 common causes. With proper diagnostic procedures, most issues can be resolved quickly and cost-effectively. "He's serious," Mark said as Betty's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "This is just how he talks." Before Betty could respond, the diner's front door opened with a chime of small bells. Eddie's peripheral vision registered the new arrival, a woman in her mid-20s wearing a dark blue uniform with medical patches on the shoulders. Emergency medical technician, his briefing materials supplied, critical infrastructure personnel. "Keisha," Betty called, "you're early today." "Got off shift an hour ago," the woman replied, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "Slow night, thank goodness." Eddie found himself studying her with more than professional interest. She moved with the efficiency of someone trained for emergency response, but her posture suggested fatigue rather than alertness. Night shift work caused circadian disruption in most humanoid species, leading to decreased cognitive function and mood instability. "That's Keisha Williams," Mark said quietly. "Betty and Roy's daughter. She's an EMT with the county." "Williams?" Eddie asked. "Related to the proprietor?" "Adopted. She and I both, actually. Roy and Betty took us in when we were teenagers." Eddie made a mental note about the family structure. An efficient social arrangement, combining resource management with kinship bonding. "Eddie," Mark said with exaggerated patience, "has anyone ever told you that you sound like you're writing a research paper when you talk?" "Several individuals have made similar observations. Is this communication pattern problematic?" "Not problematic, just makes you stand out." Keisha had finished her brief conversation with her mother and was now approaching their table. Eddie straightened automatically, his Ordani training demanding proper posture in the presence of medical personnel. "Mark," she said warmly, "I saw those Abernathy jackasses skulking around earlier. You okay?" "Yeah, they tried to rough me up, but Eddie here handled it with, questions." Mark gestured toward his companion. "Keisha, meet Eddie. Eddie's got a very systematic approach to problem solving." Eddie rose from his seat again. "Ms. Williams, I'm honored to meet someone in emergency medical services. Your work in maintaining community health infrastructure is critical to societal stability." Keisha blinked, then smiled. It was, Eddie noted, a considerably more genuine expression than her mother's professional greeting. "Well, that's one way to put it. Most people just say, 'Thanks for keeping us alive.'" "That would be insufficiently specific," Eddie replied seriously. "Your role encompasses trauma stabilization, emergency transport coordination, and serve as the primary interface between civilians and advanced medical care. The complexity of your responsibilities should be acknowledged accurately." "He talks like this all the time," Mark said helpfully. "I'm getting that," Keisha said, her smile widening. "Where did you say you were from, Eddie?" "I have been traveling extensively, studying different communities and their operational systems." "And what have you learned about Millbrook so far?" Eddie consulted his mental notes. "The settlement demonstrates strong community cohesion despite suboptimal urban planning. The integration of family structures appears to prioritize emotional bonds over biological relationships, suggesting adaptive social flexibility. The local population shows remarkable tolerance for individual behavior variations, though outliers exist." "That's a fancy way of saying we're friendly to weird folks," Keisha translated. "I would not characterize anyone as weird," Eddie said carefully. "Individual variations in behavior patterns are normal within any population group." Keisha and Mark exchanged glances. "Honey," Keisha said gently, "you just spent 5 minutes describing my job like you're writing a manual. And before that, you apparently talked 3 grown men into walking away from a fight. You're a little weird, but that's okay. Weird can be good." Eddie considered this assessment. In his briefing materials, weird was typically associated with social rejection and community ostracism. However, Ms. Williams' tone suggested the opposite. "I appreciate your tolerance for behavioral variations," he said formally. "We'll work on making you sound less like a robot," she said with another smile. "But for now, welcome to Millbrook, Eddie." Eddie felt something unfamiliar in his chest. "Thank you, Ms. Williams. I believe I am going to find this community very educational." Over the following weeks, Eddie established what he privately classified as optimal integration protocols. He rented a small apartment above the hardware store, secured employment as a general maintenance technician for the county, and began a systematic study of Millbrook's operational systems. The study, he discovered, was more complex than his initial parameters had suggested. "Eddie," Roy Williams called from the kitchen of the diner, "you want to take a look at this cooler situation?" Eddie set aside the inventory optimization charts he'd been preparing for Betty, an 18-page analysis of their supply chain inefficiencies, complete with seasonal demand projections and vendor cost comparisons, and followed Roy into the kitchen. The walk-in cooler was, by any reasonable standard, a disaster. The temperature gauge showed readings that fluctuated between acceptable and catastrophic. Strange noises emerged from the cooling unit at irregular intervals, and there was a persistent puddle of water near the door that suggested seal failure. "Been acting up for a month now," Roy said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Repair guy quoted me $800 just to take a look at it." Eddie examined the unit systematically, running his hands along the seals, checking the drainage system, and listening to the compressor cycles. The diagnosis was straightforward. The thermostat was failing. The drain line was partially blocked, and the door seal needed replacement. Total repair cost, with generic parts, approximately $53. "The issues are interconnected but manageable," he reported. "The primary thermostat has developed an inconsistent switching pattern, causing temperature fluctuations that stress the compressor. Secondary problems include blocked drainage and door seal deterioration. I can repair all the issues for the cost of parts if you would find that acceptable." Roy stared at him. "You can fix it?" "The repairs require basic mechanical skills and standard replacement components. I estimate 4 hours of labor." "Son, if you can get that thing working properly, dinner's on the house for a month." Eddie spent the afternoon disassembling the cooling unit with the methodical care he had once applied to weapons maintenance demonstrations. The mechanical principles were identical: identify the failure points, replace or repair damaged components, test the system until it operated within acceptable parameters. By early evening, the cooler was running smoothly at a consistent 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The strange noises had ceased, and the water puddle had disappeared. "I'll be damned," Roy said, checking the temperature gauge. "Runs better than it has in years." "The compressor will operate more efficiently now that the temperature cycling has been eliminated," Eddie explained. "You should see a reduction in your electrical consumption of approximately 12%. Roy's response was to envelop Eddie in what appeared to be some kind of aggressive, embracing behavior. "Roy's hugs take some getting used to," Keisha said from the kitchen doorway, "but they're worth it." She had changed from her EMT uniform into civilian clothes, jeans and a sweater that brought out the warmth in her dark eyes. Eddie found himself momentarily distracted from his systematic environmental observations. "Ms. Williams," he said formally, "I did not realize you were present. Just got here. Mom called and said you were performing miracles on the kitchen equipment." She moved closer to examine his work, and Eddie caught a faint scent of something floral. Shampoo, perhaps, or soap? "Pretty impressive for someone who supposedly just fixes things as a hobby." "I have extensive experience with mechanical systems," Eddie said carefully. "Most operational principles are universal." "What kind of work did you do before you came here?" This was dangerous territory. Eddie had prepared cover stories, but maintaining them required careful attention to detail. "Maintenance and systems analysis, various locations." "Military?" Keisha asked. Eddie froze. His briefing materials had indicated that military service was common among human males, and would explain his systematic approach to problems. But claiming military experience felt somehow wrong, like stealing honor he had not earned. "Not exactly," he said finally. "More technical consulting." Keisha nodded, apparently satisfied with the vague explanation. "Well, whatever you did before, you're a natural at this stuff. Roy's been complaining about that cooler for months." "It was a straightforward repair," Eddie said. "The apparent complexity was due to multiple simultaneous failures, creating cascading system degradation." "You know," Keisha said thoughtfully, "most people would just say, yeah, it was pretty broken. That would be insufficiently precise." "There you go again." But she was smiling. "Eddie, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Would you be interested in participating in a romantic partnership?" Eddie's brain seemed to stop functioning entirely. He stared at Keisha, trying to process what she had just said and failing completely. "I'm sorry?" he managed. "Could you repeat that?" Keisha's eyes widened. "Oh, God, no, I was making fun of how you talk. I meant to ask if you wanted to go out sometime, like
on a date, but it came out all formal and weird like you would say it, and now I sound crazy." Eddie felt relief, followed immediately by disappointment, followed by confusion. "You were imitating my speech patterns?" "Badly, yes, I'm sorry." Keisha looked genuinely mortified. "I didn't mean to make fun of you. It's just that you have this very formal way of talking, and I thought it would be funny to ask you out the same way. But now I've just made everything awkward." "You were asking me to accompany you on a social recreational activity?" "A date, Eddie. I was asking you on a date." Eddie consulted his cultural briefing materials. Dating was a human courtship ritual that served as a precursor to romantic partnerships and eventual genetic bonding. It typically involved shared meals, recreational activities, and extended conversation to assess compatibility. "I would be honored to participate in a date with you," he said formally. Keisha laughed, but it was a warm sound rather than mockery. "Okay, but we're going to work on making you sound less like you're agreeing to a business contract. What alternative phrasing would you recommend? How about, 'I'd like that,' or 'sounds great,' or even just 'yes'?" "Yes," Eddie said experimentally. "Much better. Friday night, we could drive over to Augusta, see a movie, get dinner. That would be acceptable. I mean, yes, I would like that." Keisha's smile was bright enough to power the newly repaired cooler. "Great! It's a date!" As she walked away, Eddie reflected on his first successful romantic negotiation. The process had been more complex than his briefing materials had suggested, involving humor, social mimicry, and emotional nuance that defied systematic analysis. Perhaps this explained the complete lack of Ordani records on the subject. The date, Eddie discovered, was simultaneously the most terrifying and most enjoyable experience of his mission so far. Keisha had selected a movie featuring explosions, improbable physics, and dialogue that made Eddie wince with its logical inconsistencies. But she laughed at the appropriate moments, made sarcastic comments about the protagonist's tactical errors, and occasionally leaned against him during the louder action sequences. The physical contact activated systems Eddie hadn't known he possessed. His cardiac rate increased, his palms grew damp, and he found it difficult to concentrate on cataloging the film's numerous technical inaccuracies. "You okay?" Keisha whispered during a particularly implausible chase sequence. "You seem tense." "I am experiencing some difficulty processing multiple simultaneous stimuli," Eddie replied quietly. "The movie's too loud?" "Not the movie. You." Keisha turned to look at him, and Eddie realized he had said something significant without consulting his cultural references first. "That's either really sweet or really creepy," she said after a moment. "Apologies. I didn't mean to behave in a creepy manner. Your proximity is distracting in a positive way." "Distracting how?" Eddie considered how to explain that her physical presence was causing his nervous system to behave in ways that had no operational purpose, but felt incredibly important. "I find myself wanting to optimize our interaction for your satisfaction, rather than maintaining objective observational protocols," he said finally. Keisha stared at him for several seconds while explosions painted shifting colors across her face. "Eddie," she said softly, "that might be the sweetest thing anyone's ever said to me." "Really?" "Really." The remainder of the movie passed in a pleasant haze of shared popcorn and occasional hand-holding. Eddie's mission parameters had not included instructions for managing the warm pressure of Keisha's palm against his, or the way she traced patterns on his knuckles with her thumb during quiet scenes. Dinner afterward was at a restaurant that specialized in what Keisha called fancy comfort food, elevated versions of simple dishes that seemed designed to demonstrate that complexity did not necessarily improve function. Eddie scanned the menu methodically while Keisha watched with obvious amusement. "You read that thing like you were studying for an exam," she said. "I am analyzing the available options for optimal nutritional value and cost efficiency. Or you could just pick something that sounds good." "How do I determine what sounds good without proper analysis?" What do you like to eat?" Eddie paused. His nutritional requirements were based on caloric density and vital nutrient content, with minimal consideration for what humans called taste. The question had never occurred to him. "I am not certain," he admitted. "I typically select foods based on functional requirements rather than preference." "Okay, that's actually kinda sad." Keisha leaned forward. "What did you eat growing up? What did your mom cook for you?" Another dangerous question. Eddie's creation had involved genetic engineering and artificial gestation, not maternal care and childhood meals. "I did not have a traditional family structure," he said carefully. "Oh." Keisha's expression softened. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have assumed. It is okay. I have adapted to managing my nutritional needs independently." "Well, we're gonna fix that. Trust me?" "Yes." Keisha ordered for both of them. Fried chicken with mac and cheese, green beans, and cornbread. The combination seemed nutritionally inefficient, but when the food arrived, Eddie discovered something his briefing materials had not adequately described: the difference between fuel and pleasure. The chicken was crispy and seasoned with spices that made his mouth water. The mac and cheese was rich and creamy in a way that seemed to activate reward centers in his brain. Even the cornbread, which served no obvious nutritional purpose, tasted like comfort in solid form. "Good?" Keisha asked, watching him eat with obvious satisfaction. "This is remarkable," Eddie said around a mouthful of food. "The flavor combinations create a sensory experience that exceeds their nutritional function." "Most people just say delicious." "Delicious," Eddie repeated, testing the word. "Yes, this is delicious." "There you go. See? You can enjoy things without analyzing them to death." Eddie considered this while consuming another piece of chicken. Perhaps there was wisdom in allowing some experiences to exist without systematic categorization. "Keisha," he asked after they had finished eating, "might I ask you a question?" "Shoot." "Why did you ask me on this date?" She tilted her head, considering the question. "You really want to know?" "Yes." "Because you're different. Not just the way you talk, though that's part of it. You see things differently than most people. When those guys were hassling Mark, you didn't try to fight them or scare them off. You just asked them questions until they didn't want to be there anymore. That's smart. And when Roy complained about that cooler, you didn't just offer to look at it. You actually fixed it, better than it was before. You pay attention to things and you try to help." She paused to take a sip of her drink. "Plus," she added with a grin, "you're kind of adorable when you're trying to figure out normal human behavior." "Normal human behavior is quite complex," Eddie said seriously. "Tell me about it. I've been trying to figure it out for 26 years. They walked back to Keisha's truck in comfortable silence. Keisha's hand warmly in his. The evening had been a success by any reasonable metric, but Eddie found himself reluctant for it to end. "I enjoyed this," he said as they reached the vehicle. "Me too." Keisha turned to face him. "Eddie?" "Yes?" "You can kiss me now if you want to." Eddie's cultural briefing materials had included extensive information about human courtship rituals, including physical expressions of affection. But the materials had been theoretical, lacking practical application guidelines. "I would like to," he said, "but I am uncertain about proper technique." Keisha's laugh was soft and warm. "Just follow my lead." She stepped closer, rising up on her toes to close the distance between them. Her lips were soft and warm, and the kiss was gentle, tentative, perfect in its simplicity. When they separated, Eddie felt as though his understanding of the universe had shifted slightly. "How was that?" Keisha asked. "Optimal," Eddie said, then corrected himself. "I mean, wonderful. That was wonderful." "Good answer." As Keisha drove Eddie home, he reflected on the evening's events. His mission parameters had called for observational study of human social dynamics, but somewhere during dinner, his objectives had changed. He was no longer simply studying Keisha Williams, He was falling in love with her. 2 weeks later, Eddie stood in the Williams family kitchen, presenting Roy and Betty with a formal written request. "What is this?" Betty asked, examining the document with obvious bewilderment. "A courtship intention declaration," Eddie explained. "I am formally requesting permission to pursue a romantic relationship with your daughter." Roy and Betty exchanged the kind of look that married couples develop after decades of shared communication. "Son," Roy said gently, "you know Keisha's 26 years old, right? She doesn't need our permission to date anyone." "Nevertheless, I believe it is appropriate to demonstrate respect for your family structure and authority," Eddie replied. "I have prepared a comprehensive analysis of my qualifications as a romantic partner, including my employment history, financial stability, and long-term relationship objectives." "He wrote us a resume," Betty said faintly, "for dating our daughter." "The document includes character references and a detailed outline of my intentions regarding courtship progression, potential cohabitation, and eventual family planning," Eddie continued helpfully. Mark, who had been quietly eating breakfast at the counter, started laughing so hard he nearly choked on his coffee. "This is either the most respectful thing I've ever seen," he managed between laughs, "or the weirdest." "Both," Roy said, still reading Eddie's document. "Definitely both." "Eddie, honey," Betty said, sitting down across from him at the counter, "we appreciate that you want to do right by Keisha, but this," she waved the papers, "this isn't how normal people handle dating." "I was concerned about my lack of experience with normal social protocols," Eddie admitted. "I wanted to ensure I followed appropriate procedures." "What kind of family did you grow up in?" Roy asked. "Military?" "Not exactly. I did not have a traditional family structure." Eddie's expression immediately softened. "Oh, sweetheart, you aged out of foster care, didn't you?" Eddie had no idea what that meant, but the sympathy in her voice suggested it was tragic. "I have been independent for some time." "Well, that explains it," Roy said, folding up the papers. "Listen, son, we appreciate the thought, but around here, we keep things simple. You treat our daughter right, you're welcome in this house. You heard her, and you'll answer to us. That's it." "What constitutes treating her right?" "Be honest with her. Be reliable. Support her dreams, even if they don't make sense to you. Show up when you say you will. And for God's sake, don't overthink every little thing." Eddie made mental notes of each requirement. These seem like reasonable parameters. "They're not parameters," Betty said gently. "They're just being a good person." "I want to be a good person," Eddie said seriously. "For Keisha and for your family. You have all been very kind to me." Betty reached across the counter and patted his hand. "You already are a good person, honey. You just express it a little differently than most folks." "Besides," Mark added, "Keisha likes different. Have you seen some of the guys she dated before you? Trust me, weird and respectful is a major upgrade." "I am not weird," Eddie protested. "I am systematically thorough." "Same thing around here," Roy said with a grin. "Welcome to the family, son." Eddie felt that unfamiliar warmth in his chest again, stronger than before. Family. He had never had a family. "Thank you," he said formally. "I will endeavor to meet your expectations." "Just love our daughter," Betty said. "Everything else will work itself out." Love. Eddie knew the word from his cultural briefings, but experiencing it was entirely different. Love was not systematic or efficient. It was chaotic and overwhelming and absolutely essential. "I believe I can manage that," he said. And for the first time since his deployment, Eddie found himself hoping his mission would never end. Dr. Domingo had seen plenty of unusual blood work in his 15 years practicing emergency medicine. But this mysterious Eddie's results made him run the tests 3 times before accepting that the numbers were accurate. The patient had been brought in after a minor accident at the diner, a fall from a ladder while helping Roy install new light fixtures. Standard procedure for any head injury, even minor ones, was a simple blood panel. What Dr. Domingo found instead were genetic markers that had no business existing in any human being. He stared at the lab results, then at the patient file, then back at the results. Eddie Smith, according to his paperwork, was a 30-year-old maintenance worker with no significant medical history. But his blood contained artificial genetic sequences that looked like someone had been playing genetic Lego with human DNA. "Maria!" he called to his lab technician. "Run the Smith sample again. Different equipment this time." "Already did, Doctor. Twice. Same results." Dr. Domingo rubbed his temples. In medical school, they'd covered genetic engineering, but that was theoretical research-level stuff. This looked like someone had actually built custom genetic sequences and inserted them into a living human being, which was impossible, wasn't it? He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Dr. Serena Yoon at the CDC research facility in Atlanta. They'd been colleagues during residency, and Serena now specialized in exactly the kind of weird biological anomalies that kept him awake at night. "Serena, it's Carlos Domingo down in Millbrook. I've got something I need you to look at." Dr. Serena Yoon received the blood sample from Millbrook with the kind of professional curiosity that had made her one of the CDC's go-to specialists for unusual cases. Carlos had a good eye for genuine anomalies, and his description of the genetic markers had been intriguing enough to bump this case to the top of her analysis queue. What she found when she ran the initial screening made her call her supervisor. "Tom, I need you to look at something, and I need you to activate the X protocol." Dr. Thomas Reeves had been with the CDC for 23 years, and he'd only had to implement the X protocol, the procedures for handling potential non-terrestrial biological material, twice in his career. Both times had been false alarms. "What you got?" "Genetic sequences that don't exist in nature. Not engineered, not modified, built from scratch. Like someone designed a human being from the ground up and got it about 99% right." Reeves studied the analysis results. After 23 years of government service, very little surprised him anymore. This did. "Where did this sample come from?" "Small town in Georgia. Local doctor sent it up after a routine inquiry. The patient has no idea he's anything other than normal." "And he's not?" "Tom, this man is carrying genetic code that's beyond anything we can currently produce. Whoever made him has technology that's about 50 years ahead of our best research." Reeves made the call to the Joint Pentagon-NSA task force that handled exactly these kinds of impossible situations. The task force that officially did not exist. Within 6 hours, a very quiet investigation had begun in Millbrook, Georgia. Eddie noticed the surveillance on the third day. The unmarked sedan parked across from his apartment was occupied by individuals who were trying very hard to appear casual while maintaining visual contact with his building. Their operational technique was adequate but not exceptional. Military or law enforcement, probably federal. More concerning were the surveillance devices that had been installed around the diner. Small, nearly invisible. But Eddie's training accounted for electromagnetic signatures of listening equipment. Something had compromised his cover. "You're quiet today," Keisha observed, refilling his coffee cup during the lunch rush. "Everything okay?" Eddie had been debating whether to involve the Williams family in his security concerns. His training suggested maintaining operational security by avoiding civilian involvement. His heart suggested that these people deserved to know they might be in danger. "Keisha," he said quietly, "I need to speak with you privately. Soon." "How soon?" "Tonight, after you finish your shift." "Serious conversation soon, or I need to tell you something sweet soon?" "Very serious." "Okay." Her voice carried the calm professionalism she used with trauma patients. "My place, around 11. Eddie nodded and returned to his systematic study of the diner's other customers. 3 of them were carrying concealed weapons, and 2 were paying far too much attention to his conversation with Keisha. His peaceful life in Millbrook was about to end. "I am not actually human," Eddie said. Keisha, who had been expecting a conversation about relationship progression or possibly career changes, sat down heavily on her couch. "I'm sorry, what?" "I am a failed alien military project. My creators designed me to be a perfect soldier, but the process resulted in genetics that are 99.9% identical to your species. They were disappointed by my lack of exceptional capabilities, so they deployed me here to study human social dynamics." Keisha stared at him for several long seconds. "Eddie," she said carefully, "are you having some kind of breakdown? Because if you are, that's okay. We can get you help." "I know this sounds implausible." "Implausible? Eddie, you just told me you're an alien." Eddie withdrew his mission communication device from his jacket pocket. It was roughly the size of a smartphone. The interface activated at his touch, displaying holographic text in Ordani script. "This is my communication link with my command structure," he said. "I have been filing regular reports on my integration into your community." Keisha reached out tentatively to touch the hologram. Her fingers passed through the light projection, but the device's sensors detected her proximity and shifted the display to accommodate her perspective. "That's not human technology," she said faintly. "No, it is not. You're actually an alien?" "Yes. But you look completely human." "The genetic engineering process appears to have recreated human DNA with remarkable accuracy. My creators did not realize this until after my creation." Keisha stood up and walked to her kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and drank it slowly, while staring at Eddie over the rim. "So, when you said you didn't have a traditional family structure, I was grown in a laboratory. My parents are military scientists. And when you said you had extensive experience with mechanical systems, I was trained as a weapons and warfare engineering specialist before my reassignment to observational duties." "Jesus Christ, Eddie!" She sat back down, but farther away from him this time. "How long have you been lying to me?" "I have never lied to you. I have omitted information and allowed you to draw incorrect conclusions, but every statement I have made about my feelings and intentions has been completely accurate." "Your feelings?" I love you, Keisha. That is not part of my mission parameters. That is not something I was programmed to experience. That is a choice I made, and it is the most important choice of my existence." Tears were running down her face now. "You love me?" "Yes." "But you're not human, at least not entirely." "No." "And the government is looking for you?" "Yes. Your government agencies have initiated retrieval operations. Consequently, so have my creators. I have been under surveillance for several days." Keisha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Are we in danger? Is my family in danger?" "I do not believe so. Neither side wants to create a public incident, but they will attempt to apprehend me, so anyone who interferes may be considered a security risk." "What happens if they catch you?" "My creators will likely terminate me as a failed experiment. Your government will probably attempt to study me indefinitely." "Those are both terrible options." "Yes." Keisha stood up again and began pacing around her small living room. Eddie remained seated, giving her space to process the information. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay. You're an alien who was sent here to spy on us, but you fell in love with me instead. And now both sides want to capture you." "That is an accurate summary." "And you told me this because—" "Because I believe there is a third option, but I will need help." "What kind of help?" Eddie explained his plan. The plan required precise timing, community cooperation, and a fair amount of luck. Eddie's mission parameters had included detailed technical specifications for all of his biological systems, including the biosensors that allowed his creators to monitor his vital signs from orbit. According to the documentation buried in subsection 42J of his operational manual, high-yield electromagnetic pulses could cause irreparable damage to primary biosensor arrays, resulting in null life sign readings. The power line construction project on the edge of town provided the perfect opportunity. "This is crazy," Mark said for the third time as they reviewed the plan in the diner's back room. "You want to fake your death by getting electrocuted?" "The electrical discharge will destroy my internal monitoring systems," Eddie explained patiently. "To Ordani sensors, I will appear to have died. Human authorities will see a tragic accident involving a helpful citizen who tried to save a worker from a downed power line." "And if you're wrong about the voltage levels?" Roy asked. "Then I will actually die, which solves the retrieval problem permanently." "That's not funny," Betty said sharply. "I was not attempting humor. I was acknowledging the risk parameters." "Eddie," Keisha said quietly, "there has to be another way." "I have analyzed all possible alternatives. This is the only solution that allows me to remain in Millbrook without endangering your family." "People are going to ask questions," Mark pointed out. "People around here mind their own business," Roy replied, "especially when it comes to protecting someone who's been good to the community." "Eddie fixed the Hendersons' tractor," Betty added, "and he helped organize the church fundraiser, and he calculated the optimal traffic pattern for the Harvest Festival. He saved my ass from those idiots," Mark said, "literally." "He makes our daughter happy," Roy concluded. "That's enough for me." Eddie felt that familiar warmth in his chest, stronger than ever. These people were willing to risk federal prosecution to protect him. Not because he was useful, or because they owed him anything, because they had chosen to consider him family. "Thank you," he said formally. "All of you." "Don't thank us yet," Keisha said grimly. "We still have to pull this off." The staged incident occurred at 2:21 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. Eddie had been helping the construction crew install new power lines along Route 18 when one of the high-voltage cables accidentally broke free from its restraints. A construction worker and family friend named Jim, who had been briefed on the plan, shouted for help as he stumbled backward toward the energized line. Eddie, playing his part perfectly, rushed forward to push Jim to safety. The electrical discharge was visible from 3 miles away. Keisha arrived with the ambulance exactly 4 minutes later, her partner handling crowd control while she worked on the victim. Eddie's body showed all the signs of severe electrical trauma: burns, cardiac arrest, complete loss of vital signs. "He's gone," she announced after several minutes of dramatic resuscitation attempts. "Time of death, 2:43 p.m. The federal agents who had been monitoring the situation from their unmarked vehicles could only watch as the ambulance departed for the county morgue. Their surveillance target was dead, the threat neutralized by random accident. High in orbit, Ordani sensors registered the catastrophic failure of 887 Beta's biosensor array and the complete cessation of all monitored life signs. Commander Nix Valdris filed her report. The defective unit had been destroyed in an industrial accident, eliminating the security risk. Both sides packed up their equipment and departed, satisfied that the problem had been resolved. Hidden in the morgue's cold storage unit, Eddie waited for nightfall while Keisha sat vigil, officially documenting the deceased while actually monitoring his actual vital signs with portable equipment. "How are you feeling?" she whispered. "Cold, uncomfortable, but functional. The burns look really convincing." Theatrical makeup from Mark's college drama supplies. He is remarkably skilled at creating realistic injuries. At midnight, Keisha officially signed the death certificate for Eddie Smith. The body would be cremated the following morning, as per the deceased's wishes. The body that was actually cremated belonged to the county morgue's unclaimed remains from the previous year, a homeless John Doe who had died of natural causes with no family to claim him. Eddie Smith was officially dead. Eric Thompson, who bore a remarkable resemblance to the deceased, moved to Millbrook a week later. 3 months later, Eric Thompson sat in William's family diner, sharing breakfast with his fiancée and her family, while reviewing safety inspection reports for the county school system. "Everything look good?" Roy asked, refilling Eric's coffee cup. "The elementary school's fire suppression system needs updated batteries, and the high school's emergency exits require better signage. But otherwise, all facilities meet or exceed safety standards." "You know," Betty said, sliding another plate of biscuits onto the table, "for someone who's supposed to be starting fresh, you sound an awful lot like someone we used to know." "I have been told I have a very systematic approach to problem solving," Eric replied solemnly. "Must be a coincidence," Mark said with a grin, "though it's weird how you knew exactly how Keisha likes her coffee." "I am very observant. And you happen to know that Roy's cooler needed that specific replacement part. I have extensive experience with refrigeration systems. And you just happen to settle in the exact same town where your exact same face wouldn't seem strange to anyone. I find small communities have optimal social dynamics for integration." Keisha, who had been quietly eating her eggs during this exchange, finally spoke up. "You know what I find weird?" "What?" Eric asked. "I find it weird that Eric Thompson has the exact same scar on his left hand that Eddie Smith got when he was fixing our cooler." Eric examined his hand carefully. "That is unusual. And he has the same birthmark behind his right ear. Genetic coincidences are more common than most people realize. And," Keisha said, standing up and walking around the table to sit next to him, "he kisses exactly the same way." She demonstrated this point thoroughly, to the amusement of her family and the satisfaction of the man who was definitely not Eddie Smith. "Well," Betty said after they separated, "I guess Eric Thompson is welcome in this family too." "Thank you, Mrs. Williams. I intend to be a productive member of this community for as long as circumstances permit." "How long is that likely to be?" Roy asked. Eric considered the question seriously. He had no contact with his creators, no mission parameters to fulfill, no obligations except the ones he chose to accept. For the first time in his existence, his future was entirely his own decision. "Permanently," he said. "I believe I would like to stay permanently." "Good," Keisha said, settling back into her chair but keeping her hand in his. "Because I've got plans for you, Mr. Thompson." "What kind of plans?" "Well, first we're going to work on making you sound less like an instruction manual when you talk. I have been practicing colloquial speech patterns. I noticed you only sound like a robot about half the time now." "That represents significant improvement." "It does. And second, we're going to plan a wedding." Eric felt his cardiac rate increase and his palms grow damp. The same physiological responses he'd experienced before, but stronger. "A wedding would be optimal," he said carefully. "Eric?" "Yes? Try again." "I would like that very much." "Better. And third, we're going to raise a family and grow old together, and you're going to fix everything that breaks in this town until people stop thinking of you as the mysterious stranger and start thinking of you as that helpful guy who's been here forever." Eric consulted his mental database of possible responses and found that none of the systematic approaches seemed adequate for this moment. "Keisha?" "Yes?" "I love you too." It wasn't systematic or efficient or professionally appropriate, but it was true, and it was human, and it was exactly what he wanted to say. Sometimes, Eddie reflected as his chosen family laughed around him, the most important things couldn't be optimized or analyzed or improved. Sometimes, they just were, and that was more than sufficient. It was perfect.